The Chernobyl nuclear disaster occurred in 1986 in Ukraine when scientists lost control of the nuclear reactor. This resulted in an explosion of contaminated nuclear dust, which formed a cloud that settled over much of Eastern Europe. The radiation continued to spread around the reactor as well, spreading radiation at deadly levels. This disaster is a very rare occurrence, which has widespread and long-lasting effects. It was an extremely fast-spreading disaster, and it diffused over a majority of Europe in a short period of time. This, of course, is a very random disaster, and it is very hard to predict things like this. The Gulf of Mexico oil spill of 2010 was another human-induced disaster. Oil spills are not very common, but they do happen, especially if, like in the case of the Deepwater Horizon, they are drilling farther out to sea and deeper in higher pressures than the equipment can handle. The oil spread through the Gulf of Mexico, and the oil formed a thin coat on the surface of the water, which is very hard to remove. This led to its widespread and long-lasting effects. The wellhead that was leaking oil was not capped until months after the explosion, so it was gushing millions of barrels of crude oil into the Gulf of Mexico, and it allowed it to diffuse around the area for a long time. Oil spills are hard to predict as well, as equipment malfunctions are hard to predict. In comparison, Chernobyl was a faster-occurring disaster which had longer-term effects on a larger area than the Gulf of Mexico oil spill. The only way which the Gulf of Mexico oil spill was worse is because it was more expected, obviously because they were pushing their equipment to the limit. Also, there are many more offshore drilling rigs than nuclear reactors, which make oil spills statistically more likely than nuclear explosions.
There are several socioeconomic variations in vulnerability for Chernobyl. Firstly, wealth. The disruption of trade associated with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the introduction of market mechanisms, prolonged recessionary trends, and Russia's financial crisis of 1998 all accumulate to undercut living standards, increase unemployment, and worsen poverty. These factors increase the vulnerability of people in Chernobyl to risks because they have less access to individual and community resources to be resilient to the hazard impacts. In terms of education, the lack of experience and knowledge of the issue led to the vulnerability of the population to the impacts of the hazard. Because of the rapid speed of onset and rare frequency of the hazard, many were not prepared to deal with it. Another socioeconomic variation in vulnerability is health. People were vulnerable to health consequences because they were reluctant to accept the existence of an invisible enemy and did not want to leave the contaminated area when they were forced to. This increased their vulnerability to contract detrimental health consequences as a result of the contaminated environment. In terms of gender, males were more vulnerable to radioactive health issues because all of the people who had to stay behind were males. The males were the ones who had to clean up the radioactive wastes and breathe the radioactive air, while the females got to be evacuated. In terms of housing, the people who lived in the 30-kilometer exclusion zone, an area of 30-kilometer radius from the Chernobyl power plant, were the most vulnerable to the detrimental effects of the hazard and were evacuated immediately. This 30-kilometer exclusion zone was established after the explosion had occurred and was considered as an area with the highest radioactive contamination. There were various socioeconomic variations in vulnerability for the BP oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico as well. Firstly, in terms of wealth, BP's cost-cutting made it a lot more vulnerable to the effects of a hazard event. They cancelled a cement bond log test that would have cost a lot of money, though it would have prevented the explosion from occurring. In terms of education, the causes of the BP oil spill were mainly due to human errors. This means that education is one of the most prominent factors of vulnerability to the explosion. Prior to the explosion, Halliburton, the company that carried out a cement job at the site, had pumped cement into the well before looking at test data to make sure it was stable. This led to the failure of the cement at the base of the well to contain oil and gas within the well bore. Had Halliburton been aware of the consequences, this would not have occurred. After the failure of the cement, a series of human and mechanical error allowed the natural gas under tremendous pressure to shoot out onto the drilling platform, causing an explosion. The failure of the workers to recognize these errors beforehand made them more vulnerable to the impacts of the explosion. In terms of health, the coastal residents are vulnerable to mental health problems that range from anxiety and depression to post-traumatic stress syndrome. Coastal residents are also vulnerable to consuming seafood that is contaminated with high levels of chemicals from the hazard. Both men and women were equally vulnerable to risk because there were no means of evacuation. However, the rig workers who stayed behind to clear up and save lives after the hazard were all men. In terms of housing, people who lived in the coastal area were more vulnerable to the risks of the hazard because they were the closest to where the hazard had occurred.
Demographic variations in vulnerability for Chernobyl. Communities that were affected by the disaster suffered through a highly distorted demographic structure. Due to immigration and voluntary migration, percentage of older people were very high, such as population of pensioners equals or older people who exceeded the working age. The more affected the area is, the older its population. Large population of skilled, educated and working age mostly evacuated and left the region, hindering the chances for economic recovery and leading to poverty. Departure of young people also had psychological effects. The growing aging population encouraged the belief that the areas affected were a dangerous place to live. Schools, hospital, companies, and other organizations didn't have enough qualified specialists, even when they kept their pay really high, and therefore the social services were also threatened. In terms of health and diseases, there was an increase in thyroid cancer among children due to iodine-131 inhaled or eaten. Before the disaster took place, only 2 cases per year were reported. However, after 10 years of the disaster, 500 cases were reported. Demographic variations in vulnerability for Gulf of Mexico spill. Due to deep water horizon spill in Gulf of Mexico, all dispersant was also used to clean the water, which caused illness by the chemicals present in the all dispersant. The addition of dispersants created toxic substances when mixed with crude oil and eventually making people sick. The dispersants being added to water caused chemical poisoning from polyaromatic hydrocarbons. It causes eye and nose irritation, blood in urine, vomiting, and other symptoms. Again, older people are more vulnerable to these diseases since they're old and they have a weaker immune system. Also, due to the chemicals presented in the water, many people died from swimming.
Chernobyl had a wide range of variation when it comes to ethnicity with the damage it caused. And it led to that it affected 27 countries with its radioactive cloud and all the radiation that it spread, including Russia, Belarus, Ukraine, Turkey, Greece, Moldova, Romania, Bulgaria, Lithuania, Finland, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Poland, Estonia, Switzerland, Germany, Italy, Ireland, France, and Corsica, and even the UK and Canada. As opposed to that, the ethnic variations in the vulnerability for the Gulf of Mexico is a lot less, as it only really affected 3 different countries, including the US for mostly Florida and Louisiana, and Cuba and Mexico. And the people that are affected the most were the people who lived near the coast and might have been poorer and of poorer ethnicity.
The vulnerability for both the USA and the USSR were high, since this event cannot be predicted. However, the USA has a lower vulnerability since there are proven and tested methods of containing oil spills. The oil spill was also more environmental rather than causing direct death on contact. The USSR, on the other hand, had experienced something never before witnessed. Nuclear physics was still in its infancy. The nuclear meltdown has affected a greater area and had the potential to wipe out half of Europe. It also has a greater effect on the population since it can cause cancers and mutations. In the USA, they were adapting to the change. Rather than moving out, they stayed and employed the use of technology to clean up the oil spill. However, the USSR, in comparison, was largely fatalistic. Most of the people chose to stay there, citing the reason that they could not see the problem. This could be in part due to their education about nuclear physics and their possible effects. For practices, the USA used methods such as chemical dispersants. However, there was a problem associated with this. Corexit, one of the dispersants that BP used, made the oil 52 times more toxic. Microbes both natural and man-made, ate the oil and contributed to the boom of plankton, since the plankton ate the bacteria, and therefore it contributed to the ecosystem probably. The use of booms to prevent extensive damages to the beaches, and they also siphoned off oil through the tankers. The USSR, in comparison, had a top-down government that didn't inform the population of Chernobyl about possible effects. They also sacrificed human life through soldiers and through liquidators to clean up the reactor. They also evacuated the town of Chernobyl, as in comparison to the US, who didn't evacuate at all. They also had a slower initial response.